Good afternoon. My name is Amy Glass. I'm the coordinator of the One Book, One College program here at ICC. And we are here today to hear from Colleen Karn. She is a teacher of humanities and English at Methodist College. She's been there for 6 years. Before that, she actually taught here at ICC for many years. And she has focusing, and she's a doctoral student at ISU, focus on literary and cultural studies. And her expertise is on horror and Frankenstein. Last year she gave a presentation at the Popular Culture Association on something called Frankenstein's American Success Story, a case study of Munsters as agents of social change. And also this past summer, she was lucky enough to go to Rome and give a presentation on something called Nazi Devils and Jewish Werewolves, the horror of dehumanization in John Landis's American Werewolf in London. So if you've seen that movie, which is a great movie, by the way, she gave a presentation on that here too. So at this point, I'd like to have you welcome Colleen.
Hi, I am really glad to be here. And I am a huge Frankenstein nerd. I'll just be completely honest. And when I asked how long would you like me to speak, and I was told about 40 minutes, I thought, I can cut it to 40 minutes. No. What I'm going to be using as my prop today will be a blog called Frankenworld that I created. It's the idea that Frankenstein is not just a novel, that it is an entire narrative world created from that one particular narrative by Mary Shelley back in 1818. Well, published in 1818. And so a lot of what people are talking about right now, because it's the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, is why has it lasted for 200 years? And why is it still so popular 200 years later? Why has it turned into Frankenworld instead of just being a single novel somewhere that someone's going to pull off a shelf? And that has to do with what Mary Shelley was talking about in the novel. And there are several themes if you want to think about it that way. I'm going to move these around here. So as we're looking at some information about the novel itself. So, some of the themes that are running through Frankenstein, one of the reasons why we're still talking about it today, one is, of course, man messing with nature, right? It's like, what are our limits? Where should our limits be? And the ethical responsibility of taking responsibility for what we've done. So now we think of cloning would be the perfect idea of, like, if you took Frankenstein today, cloning would be, or IA, right? Or AI, artificial intelligence. So that's the same idea. That's why we still see Frankenstein-type stories today. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as we get through this, is that it's not just Frankenstein itself that keeps getting reimagined, as in it's always with the word Frankenstein in it, or Franken-something, like Frankenweenie. But it's the fact that there are so many narratives that are derivatives of it, that are Frankenstein-esque narratives, and coming from these different themes. So that's just one of the themes. And I think that's something that, because we always fear what can man do. But some of the other things that, themes that I think are actually probably more potent would be, what does it mean to be human? And we get that a lot through Frankenstein. We get that because the monster or the creature, depending on what everybody has their preference for what they call him, our unnamed creature, questions that, right? Questions who he is. Questions, am I thy Adam, or am I thy Satan, right? So what am I, and why did you create me? And it's the same kinds of questions that are echoed through a lot of religious texts, etc. Why are we here? Why was I created? What does it mean to be human? He doesn't know if he has a soul, right? Victor thinks he doesn't have a soul. He thinks he's a soulless monster. But does he or doesn't he? We don't know. And it's that whole idea of what does it mean to be human. So that's another one of the enduring themes that comes through. And another one is, as I have here, society forming our identity. This was something that was sort of a marginalized idea at times, depending on who was talking about it, but starting to become more and more relevant in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. How does society affect us? It affect the way that we develop. And Mary Shelley looks at that, kind of thinks, maybe you haven't read Rousseau or Locke, but those are the people who are sort of talking about these sort of ideas. And so it's very evident in her narrative that the monster, the creature says, basically, I am a product of the way society has treated me. And so that's something else she looks at. But for me, the most interesting, I would say, maybe the most personal theme that runs through it is, what does it mean to be a monster? Because we don't get that in many texts. Most of the time is, what does it mean to be human? But we actually hear the monster speaking. I mean, okay, Walden's writing the letters to his sister, and he's recounting what Victor is telling him, and so we have several narrators that you're sort of being filtered through, but ultimately you tend to forget that as you're getting through the novel, and you hear the monster's voice. He speaks for a very long time, and that's a very new concept that Mary Shelley was using, was the idea that she is going to speak, let the monster speak. And so we hear what it was like for the monster to be shunned by society, to be, first of all, to be rejected and abandoned at the moment of his birth, and then to be in society as this large, scary-looking being that the other people around him were frightened of, no matter how good his heart was, no matter how, all the things that he tried to do right, all the wonderful things he tried to do. You can tell I'm a fan of the monster, and not the deadbeat dad of Victor, but, and all these things, and then how society continued to punish him, to physically hurt him, to say awful things to him, and then he says, you know what, I will be the monster that you think I am, because you've made me that way. So those are the themes that tend to run through it. And I think that the last theme that I was talking about, the idea of giving a voice to the monster, there's actually a quote I want to give you, and it's from Del Toro, who I'm a huge fan of. So Guillermo del Toro, I'm going to scroll down here. When he was receiving an award, a BAFTA award, he actually thanked Mary Shelley. He talked about Mary Shelley in his acceptance speech. And he said, the most important figure from English legacy is, incredibly for me, a teenager by the name of Mary Shelley. She has remained a figure important in my life as if it was family. And so many times when I want to give up, when I think about giving up, when people tell me dreaming of the movies and stories I dream is impossible, I think of her. Because she picked up the plight of Caliban, and she gave weight to the burden of Prometheus, and she gave voice to the voiceless and presence to the invisible, and showed me that sometimes to talk about monsters, we need to fabricate monsters of our own. And parables do that for us. And so it was that idea, that same idea of giving a voice to the voiceless, right? So she is giving voice to a lot of different marginalized populations as you go through this text. These populations that would be considered monstrous, anything outside the norm, anything that would be considered queer or other, could also be considered a monster. So women, the lower classes, these are two of the populations that she definitely champions through her monster in her novel. And one of the reasons, if we're going to go back to her actual, when she published, you all may not know this, but she originally published it anonymously. So when it came out in January of 1818, it was published anonymously. Her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a romantic poet, he's the one who got the publication together. He's the one who made the contract. He's the one who got it taken care of. And so there were some people who thought that it was Percy's work. But what happened was that, and you'll see this in the critical reception, there's not a whole lot of time to go through all of this, but as you get toward the end, the last few reviews, there were 7 major reviews done. Percy actually wrote one as well, but it was published much later, and I would think incredibly biased. So, so we're going to look at the 7 that were published in 1818. And the last 2, what happens is they figure out who the author is. And once they figured out that it was Mary writing this, not Percy, not somebody else, the critical reception shifted. And even though in the beginning a lot of the critical reception, they didn't like the social messages necessarily, but they praised the writing. They said that, talked about how well the author, almost always it was he. They just used the assumed pronoun he, except for actually it was Belles Ensemble, which was a women's magazine. They actually never used a pronoun. They kept it completely neutral, which I find really interesting. But so these 2 critical critiques written by reviewers who we don't even know who they are, they were anonymous reviewers, basically said, oh, it's a woman and that's it, we're done. Thank you for playing, go away now. You should not be writing about these things. And this was actually very normal. She's not the only woman who had these types of responses. Anne Barbauld wrote a poem that was very socially poignant, and they slaughtered her in criticism to where she stopped writing. She had written all these children's books, all these things that were acceptable for women to write. And then once she started into the social realm, into social criticism, then the critics just destroyed her. So it's no wonder, because that was 6 years prior, it's no wonder that Mary Shelley first published this, because she wanted to be taken seriously, as serious literature, not as a chapbook, not as some trashy popular culture on the side, right? She wanted to be taken seriously, so she needed to publish it anonymously, just to reinforce the idea that hers was a marginalized voice, which means that a lot of people tend to think that she's the creature, so that monster also represents her and the things that she's gone through in her life: abandonment, marginalization, having to teach herself, all of these things. If you know anything about her background, if you've read any of her biography, the biographical materials, then you'll see that there are a lot of similarities actually between the monster and Mary. So these are the big themes, right? The big themes that run through it. So to give you an idea of just how big Frankenworld is, there are on here, you'll see lists. There's a list of Frankenstein in literature. I'm not going to read it, it would take too long. And that's not everything. Those are the things that basically have the word Frankenstein in them, or Franken something, or are very, very similar. I have similar lists. Theater's not nearly as long, but when you get to film and television, those are Frankenstein films. These are ones that I would call Frankenstein-esque films, and we will get to that as well. And you'll see the same in television, where there are television shows where a Frankenstein character is the primary character, and then you will have shows where it's an episode. So it's always it's fun to go through them. It wasn't fun making the list. It took a very long time. And there's no way I have captured everything. But these are the series at the top, and then episodes of things like when you came in, I was playing a Scooby-Doo episode. And so you'll see that through so many. And as I said, and I'm sure I haven't updated it much in the last 6 months, and there's probably a whole bunch more to put on there recently. You'll see the same in music. You may not think about it, you may only hear a word or two that refers to Frankenstein, but there's actually quite a bit of Frankenstein in music. So songs and albums, music videos, and some artists who actually have made their names after, so like the Frankenstein drag queens from Planet 13. I mean, you've got Frankenstein everywhere. It has permeated our culture. It is everywhere. That's what I'm talking about today. Frankenworld. It is a world. If you want to, we can use a really great word. It's this transmediated story world. Basically, all that means is it has turned into something much, 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 much bigger than it started out as. Much bigger than I'm sure Mary Shelley could have ever imagined it would be. So some of the most interesting things, I think, for us today would be the film and the television. These are the things that we tend to be, I would say, bombarded with most often. That in popular culture that we will watch television, we watch films more than we read, unfortunately. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, what do we see in film? If you start looking at the beginning of it, the first film was actually in 1910, made by Thomas Edison, of all people. And then in 1931, Universal Pictures created the first Frankenstein film. That is the one that we all think about, right? So when I teach Frankenstein, I always ask my students, what do you know about Frankenstein? Don't look it up, before you read it, before anything, and almost inevitably, it all comes from the 1931 film or a derivative thereof. So when you see things like the Frankenstein monster that's in Hotel Transylvania, that's based on the 1931 film, that version of the creature. Now, in the 1931 film, it's so different than the book. So, if you have to read the book for class, you better read the book and not watch the film because it is not the same. There is not a single rendition, film, miniseries, anything that is really, really, I think, true to the book. So, no cheating. And what happens in the film, in the 1931 film, is that the creature's speech is taken away.
It's by a man, too, so that's pretty good.
Well, not really.
Edison, right?
Oh, I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about the 31. I'm sorry. The Universal Pictures was done by James Whale.
Oh, okay. But
And
man,
so,
right? He took away the speech of the monster.
well, what happened was it came from a play written by Peggy Webling that was being produced in London. And they did the same thing with the 1931 Frankenstein film that they had done with the 1931 Dracula, which was they took a play version, a play script, and then they translated it into a film script. And actually, the tradition of the monster not speaking goes all the way back to Presumption, the very first play. So Presumption,
Who wrote that?
I'm gonna pull it up. It's on here. So Presumption was the very first offspring of Frankenstein. It was the very first thing that came from Frankenstein that started Frankenworld. So Richard Peake, it was his play, Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein, that took away the creature's speech, that sort of dumbed it down, that condensed it. I mean, anytime you go from a novel to a film or a novel to a play, I know people are like, well, the book's better, but it's different. Because there's a short period of time that you can use to have that play or to have that film, and so you have to condense things. Well, the speech was taken away. And the bumbling servant, like the Igor servant, that's kind of where all that started, was in Presumption. And it was that then turned into that Peggy Webling used eventually when she wrote her Frankenstein play, and that Universal Studios picked up. In fact, I cannot find, I've been to the British Library looking, I cannot find a copy of Peggy Webling's play anywhere. And the issue is that, and I think it's because the Universal Studios purchased it before it was ever really published, and they would not allow it to be out. They didn't allow for the play to even be produced in the United States because they wanted those, right? They wanted them to be scared, right? They wanted to have their attention. So anyway, and what's really interesting, I have my little fun Frankenworld facts, is that Mary Shelley attended a performance of Presumption. and thought that it made her famous because someone had made a play based on her novel. And she also enjoyed the playbill because they don't name the creature, which was great. They just gave these little dash, 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 and then they had the actor after it who was playing the creature. So she really enjoyed that, which I think is wonderful. So yeah, it came out in 1823, only a few years later, 5 years later, right? Frankenworld has started. This is where it starts, and then eventually comes to us. So as we go back and we start looking at the 1931 film, so James Whale did the 1931 film based on, and it wasn't necessarily his choice. He didn't want to necessarily do this film. He agreed to do the film, and when he did it, he had to do it based on the script that was given to him. So we have, again, the voiceless creature, et cetera, but James Whale was allowed to do the 1935 film of The Bride of Frankenstein. They begged him to do it because it was so wildly popular, the 31 film of Frankenstein. And he said, fine, but I want complete artistic control. And which was brilliant. He gave voice back to the creature, not much, but he couldn't stray too far. But James Whale was a homosexual. And he put some homosexual overtones, some things running through the 1935 film. So now we have, again, someone with a marginalized voice giving voice to the creature, giving it back, which I think is very interesting. The difference between the 31 film and then The Bride of Frankenstein, very different, much more artistic, much more poignant. Watch them both. I mean, they're still a little cheesy. They're, from the 1930s. I'll play a quick clip of the bride coming to life. And it's Victor and Dr. Pretorius.
She's alive! Alive! The Bride of Frankenstein.
So what's interesting about The Bride of Frankenstein is they take really good care of her. They're very gentle with her. It's very different when the creature's brought to life in the 1931. And what's actually also really interesting is it's always the creature's right hand that moves first. It's always the same view. It's the same in Young Frankenstein. It's very similar in Frankenweenie. You see it over and over. It's the same in Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it's very, very interesting how they use the same trope of the monster coming alive to say, yes, this is where we're hailing back to. But if you notice that you've got these harps playing when the female creature comes alive, and they take very delicate care of her, and so you're getting a different message from James Whale in the second film, and a lot of messages that are more similar to the actual novel that Mary Shelley wrote. And then again, another fun Frankenworld fact, if you ever watch the credits, at the beginning of so in Edison's version, he refers to her as Mrs. Shelley. Doesn't give her a first name, right? When James Whale refers to her in the first film, because that's not really his choice, it was the studios, it was Mrs. Percy B. Shelley. Nice, right? Yeah. But when James Whale had complete artistic control, it was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And in fact, she actually shows up. That's how the film starts. You see her and Percy and Byron having their contest. And so the film actually starts with Mary Shelley as a character, and the woman, Ava Lancaster, who plays Mary Shelley, is the one who plays the bride. So it's an interesting way that it evolves. And so you see a lot of similar things in the, and it's constantly evolving then. The monster gets a voice back. We even have a parody of it, right? It's probably more people have seen the parody than have seen the film or have read the book, obviously. And that is Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. I know a lot of people think it's Mel Brooks, but Gene Wilder originally wrote the script. And then Mel Brooks got a hold of it, and together they finished it, and Mel Brooks directed, produced, etc. And what's interesting, too, is that they were able to use the actual set pieces from the 1931 and 35 films in Young Frankenstein. So there's this great kind of consistency that happens in it. But in this one, again, the creature gets even more of a voice, right? He even sings for us. Not particularly well. I'm not going to play all the clips or we'll never get through. And then we move to another, I think, big evolution, which is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And here, why is this one important? Because again, it's the idea of these marginalized populations getting a voice. Because you're dealing with homosexuality, you're dealing with bisexuality. They're the others, they're aliens from another planet, right? And even though Frankenfurter is technically, I mean, he is the bad guy, he killed Eddie. But it's still the idea that we shouldn't be afraid of it. They kind of make fun of it so that we know that being afraid of people who have a different sexual preference than us is a silly thing to do. And they do it with a lot of really fun songs and etc. And then I would say that another big evolution would be the fact that then we started having it more and more in children's narratives. We see this actually as a trend, a big trend, of monsters being in children's narratives. It happens more and more. It's Karen Coates, who's a professor of children's literature, says, you know, we've defanged the monster. That's what she always says about putting monsters into children's stories. And it was the idea for children to maybe not be so scared of these monsters. But it's still the idea that children are a marginalized population. Children's voices are often not heard. And so finding monsters showing up in those narratives is not all that surprising. What's interesting with Frankenweenie is that the creature is a dog, right? Have you guys seen Frankenweenie? And so there's no way you cannot love the monster. It is, I mean, unless you hate dogs, and shame on you if you do, you can't hate Sparky. Here's Sparky coming to life. So we now have the monster as an adorable dog who got, I'm sorry to, spoilers, but he gets run over at the beginning of the movie. And so Victor, who is brilliant, brings him back to life. And then it goes all just wonky from there, because then all the kids figure out how to do it, and then they bring all their pets back to life, but their pets don't come back quite right. And one of the pets that they want to bring back is a turtle named Shelley, spelled E-Y at the end, so that's, Thank you, Tim Burton, that was nice. So,
The dog had those little bullets.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea of those bolts, those contacts for the electricity to, to clamp on, so to put the electricity through the body, and that started in the 1931 film as well. That's where you first have that. That's where you first have the definitive electricity brought the creature to life. So for those of you who are reading the book, We don't know that that's what happens. Shelley never tells us. There are some allusions to it, and there was a lot of things happening at the time with galvanism. So the idea of experimenting with bodies with electricity, what they call animal electricity, even though that was taking place, and I'm sure was a partial inspiration for how the creature came to life, Victor never tells Walden how he does it, which I think is brilliant. It's kind of like not seeing the shark in Jaws for a long time. It's actually scarier if you don't know. And also, if you think about it, if Shelley had written in the novel, this is how it happened, somebody could have debunked it. But by never telling us, it keeps that mystery going on, just like the creature says that he's going to go kill himself now, but we don't know that that's what happens, and so it leaves it open. And so as we're going through this evolution and we're getting all these new versions of Frankenstein in Frankenworld, some other things that happen are that people are taking these same themes, these themes of either playing with nature, and it becomes more powerful than the creator, right? It always has to become more powerful than the creator. Think Terminator. More recently, think Blade Runner. Both, the original one and 2049. All of these is the idea of they're messing with nature, using science, using technology to do these things, and it becomes a little out of control. So I have some clips of some films that, though there is no Frankenstein creature in them, I would argue are Frankenstein-esque films.
Don't you see the danger, John, inherent in what you're doing here? Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
It's probably appropriate to start hoping generalizations.
If I may, I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew you had, you patented it and packaged it, slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You're selling it. Well, what?
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So we have, obviously, right, the idea of responsibility, of wielding this power, and then another, and I was so happy when I rewatched this film and heard Michael Fassbender say what he said. Because I would argue too that the X-Men movies are similar, especially when you start looking at how society is treating them, is pushing them aside, and how they react to it, right? So oftentimes you have people who are trying to be good, and society is creating monsters out of them. And if you've ever seen X-Men First Class, sorry for the spoilers, but so we have Eric Lenzer, who becomes Magneto, and he is as a child in the Nazi concentration camp. And there's someone there who's also a mutant, who realizes he has these powers and does horrible things to this young boy to get him to use his power, to get him to develop his power. And so this is after the war, and Eric is trying to find the person, the Nazi, who did this to him, who tortured him and killed his mother in front of him.
Blut und Ehre.
Ja, was würden Sie gerne zuerst verlieren?
Wir hatten unsere Befehle.
Also Blut.
Let's just say I'm Frankenstein's monster. Von meiner Rede.
So, again, another one of the themes of the idea of society creating the monster. And what's nice about this too, I mean, he's killing all these people, but the creature does do that in Shelley's novel, right? He takes out his anger on, well, unfortunately, on the innocent. Here, he's not taking it out on the innocent. But still, the people who were in collusion with the person who hurt him, who did these things to him. Another one of the themes that I talked about earlier that I said is one of the reasons why Frankenstein has endured is the idea that we hear the voice of the monster, right? That is that idea of what does it mean to be human, but more than that is the idea of what does it mean to be the monster. And the creature in Shelley's novel wants acceptance. He wants love. He wants to be part of society, right? That's what he keeps talking about, the fact that he's all alone. That's why he demands that Victor makes him a mate, because he doesn't want to be all alone. And so, and we have this theme often in Del Toro's films, but I would say that there is, it happens even more so in Hellboy. I don't know if you've seen it, if you've read the comic books. Del Toro obviously didn't create the comic books, but there are the first Hellboy film, which was in 2004, and then Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, is in 2008. I told you I was a Frankenstein nerd. When those came out, Del Toro, who obviously loves Mary Shelley, you can see he plays with these ideas of wanting to be accepted, of the monster needing love, etc. And so you'll see this here, and then you'll also see, and it's so obvious, this great homage to James Whale's film.
Did a good job out there.
Then tell me, what did I feel so good? I mean, I killed that thing. For what? They didn't even like me. I mean, they're afraid of me. What do we do with that?
Red, I don't want you to freak out. I'm gonna leave for a little bit. I need time to think.
About what? Can't you do your thinking right here? Look, I'll be really, really quiet. I'll be really tense.
Red, why are you with me? Do you need everyone to like you? Everybody? Or am I enough? Think about it.
We belong dead.
So, and what happened right before this was that he went out, he killed this really big creature that was threatening the populace, and what the people did was they ended up throwing things at him and calling him names and things like that. So very, very similar to Frankenstein's creature who saves, the person from drowning and then is, etc. So you have those same themes that tend to run through, and that, I would say, is one of the big reasons why Frankenstein endures, because there are so many things that speak to us as human beings, right? The need to belong, feeling like we are outcasts. I can't say everybody has, but I mean, to me, that's adolescence, right? The idea of being on the outside looking in. That's why we have Alice Cooper's Teenage Frankenstein, and that's what that's about. Feeling like the monster, feeling like the person pushed out. And so most of us at some point have those feelings, which is why we can identify with the creature, which is why people are empathetic to him. And then, of course, we have our fears of technology and science and all of these types of themes, like I said, that tend to run through this. But what's also interesting is if we take a look at television, and I'll about 5 more minutes, and then we can have questions and discussion. When we take a look at television, one of the first instances, probably the first instance of having a Frankenstein creature in television would be the Munsters. And Herman Munster is obviously the 1931 version, but a happy well-adjusted family man. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and move over to this tab here. So in the Munsters, if we go back and take a look at the 1931, 1935 Frankenstein, actually this is, I have to say, again, total nerd, this is the 1935 version because he's got the scar. And I should have realized that that's the 1931 version. That's after he gets burnt down at the end of the 1931. He's in this windmill, et cetera, gets set on fire. And so you can tell the difference between the two of them because if he's got the scar and some of his hairline is back further, it's because he had gotten burnt. And you'll see sometimes some of the burn mark on his cheek. That's the 1935 version versus the 1931. But you'll see the obvious similarities, right? The squared off head, the haircut, the bolts on the neck, and no one was allowed to use that look. But it was Universal Television who did it. So they owned by Universal Pictures. So they were able to use that iconic look that was brought to life by the amazing makeup designer, Jack Pierce from Universal Studios. But the difference is that Herman Munster is happy. He's got a wife, he's got a kid, he's super nice, he's the dad, he leaves in the morning. It's like your typical family, right? She gives him his lunchbox. His wife is a vampire, though kind of looks witchy, but vampire. The father is supposed to be the Dracula, the grandpa's the Dracula character, his son's a werewolf. You know, you've got all the monsters there in this TV show called The Munsters. And so it seems kind of quaint and fun, but when you stop and start looking at it, you realize that they're really commenting on society because everybody around them thinks they're freaks and they think they're normal. In fact, they have a niece named Marilyn. Think Marilyn Monroe, right? Blonde, hourglass figure, very pretty, very nice. And they think, poor girl, she's so unattractive, right? Because it's a great commentary on culture. Because it's the idea that inside of one culture, we have these norms, and this is what we value and what we think is, and then other people looking in see something different. So it was a great way to talk about culture and ethnicity and all of this diversity without singling out a specific ethnicity or religion or anything like that. And so if you think about it, The Munsters was actually brilliant. But again, it was fun, it was nice, it was happy. We're getting those sort of happier ideas. You'll also see, if you take a look, like Frankenberry came out, similar kind of time, that there's again a happy monster giving you the strawberry cereal, which I have boxes of in my office.
The syrup or
The cereal, Frankenberry cereal. It comes out every year at Halloween now. Yeah. If you are interested, Boo Berry and Count Chocula and Frankenberry come out just at Halloween. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Addams Family. You've got Lurch, who is sort of that, because he does talk, but very little. He mostly groans, so very similar to. And then, as I said before, you'll see the monster in episodes like from Scooby-Doo. Unfortunately, the link is broken. I'll have to get a new link for this. But there's a Monkeys episode where they teach this creature that looks like the Frankenstein monster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you take a look here, we have a new evolution of the Frankenstein story. You'll see it in Penny Dreadful, and you'll see it in American Horror Story. And it starts to go back to the Gothic. So we was being happier, it was for kids, and then people were like, wait a minute, there's a lot of stuff happening in our society right now that this creature, this character, this narrative can help us talk about. And so in Penny Dreadful, I don't know if you've seen it, it's a British series, and it's strange. It's not for children, and it has like Dracula, and it has like a witch and demonic possession, and it has a werewolf, and it has all these types of things all together, and you think it's going to be really trite, but it actually is very powerful as you go through these 3 seasons of it. And the acting, the cinematography is really quite good. In Penny Dreadful, there is a character. You've got Victor Frankenstein, and you've got his creature, who ends up naming himself John Clare after the Romantic poet. So he has a name. But you see his evolution. It's a different storyline. He starts off the angry, destructive, and he ends up turning into probably the kindest character there. Here's my Penny Dreadful page. I'm not going to show you the clip. It's really rather disturbing. But this is the end. Big spoiler. This is the end. This is the last shot of the whole series. And it's someone really important has died. And as you can see at the bottom, major spoiler. But it's him with her. She was the one person who was always kind to him. And it almost ends up becoming his story. So we have, again, a more realistic version of him, but it's also dark. It shows the pain he goes through. It shows all of those things, what it is to be the monster and shunned in society, and how just one person, the kindness of one person, could change all of that. You'll see some similar things in American Horror Story. There's a lot in American Horror Story as well. There's one season called Coven where there's this bus of frat boys who get, big accident, and one of the witches wants her boyfriend back, sort of. It's her boyfriend at the time, not really, and so they take all these parts from all the best parts of all the different boys. It's called Boy Parts. That's the name of the episode. And they sew him together and they bring him back to life. And he is then the Frankenstein creature for that episode. Okay, and there's so much more. And I could talk about so many more things that have come from Frankenstein that are in our culture now, all the different books. If you really like graphic novels, Chris Grimley's Frankenstein is fabulous. The drawing in Chris Grimley's is just amazing. So there's a lot of different things and if you have questions, so now I'm open for questions. Anything?
Well, actually, I was going to.
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention that Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, in The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she argues that women are the way they are. If they're silly or they're vain and they're looking after their appearance, they're doing it because society has created them as monsters. As these, and she doesn't use the word monster, but she said society has created woman to be this way. And this is not natural for women. Women, are intelligent, they want to be educated, they want to have discussions, philosophical, political discussions, and they just don't want to be left to the side. So Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley used to read her mother's works.
On her grave.
On her grave, I know, isn't that neat? But anyways, I think that's where she got that society makes it. So when we have that creature, no wonder he gets angry, because everybody mistreats him, all right from his father. And I agree that she associates, Mary Shelley associated herself with the monster because her father basically abandoned her when he remarried her stepmother, who was an awful woman apparently. And one more question. There's that new, at Willow Knolls, there's going to be a Frankenstein, you're probably going to that. There's
It's the
Benedict
Cumberbatch, the theater
and then
version.
somebody else,
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see it.
Oh, okay.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, so my question is it one plays the creature and one plays Frankenstein one night, and then the other night it's switched? So you really want to see both nights?
You want to see both nights. In fact, I have it on the theater section.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. I actually put that on my Blackboard site. So, actually for Cassidy, for my class, when is it? Is it October something? October
Yeah, it's like
I don't know the
6th
exact
and
date.
10th or something?
I'm going to have to get tickets, though,
Yeah,
ahead of
it's
time.
Gonna sell out?
I want to say it's they're doing it on like 2 Mondays. It's like the 22nd and the 29th.
So one night, so the way I understand it, if that.
One night will be, yeah, and then they'll
So
switch.
Cumberbatch plays the creature, and then the next night, this Miller guy plays the creature, and then and then when Cumberbatch is the creature, Miller plays Frankenstein.
Yeah, plays Victor.
Frankenstein. And then when they reverse, the other one is Victor Frankenstein. Now, is it exactly the same? Like, is it just the same?
I haven't seen it. That's why I'm excited to see
Yeah,
it
I know,
because
I have too. I have too.
I've been waiting for them to release it, even on like in a, there are repositories for films for education, that you can't like rent them, but you can
Right.
get them through.
Cool.
And so I've been waiting for them because to put that in there like they do with like the BBC's Secret Life of Books and things like that.
Right.
And I keep hoping that they're going to eventually, as time goes by, make it where educators can use the filming of it because I would love to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited about it, so that's don't want you
Questions or
comments.
no?
Willow Knowles, is it Willow Knowles?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah, it's Willow Knowles, yeah.
No questions? Okay.
Oh,
Well, thank you.
One more
Oh,
thing I
yeah.
want, Caliban. I'm glad you mentioned Caliban because I also sympathize with Caliban because he likes music.
Mm-hmm.
Music, he said he likes to dream and he likes to sleep because he can hear the music and the twangling of the music. And I felt sorry for him. And then my students would say, yeah, but he tries raping Miranda. Well, a little minor flaw there.
It's like the
Oh, what's
Frankenstein.
interesting actually is that in Penny Dreadful, the creature, Frankenstein's creature, the first name he gets is Caliban because he gets taken in by a man who's an actor. And so he's like, it's okay, you can come and work at the theater, we're a family here, et cetera, et cetera. And he thought he was in an industrial accident, is that why he looked the way he did. And he names him Caliban. And then eventually Caliban, he's like, that is not the name I want, right? So he ends up renaming himself John Clare after the Romantic poet. So that's actually really interesting. And then, Del Toro's like, the plight of Caliban. And I agree. It's that marginalized voice. Shakespeare couldn't really, you have to be careful when your patron's the king or the queen, what you're going to do when they're colonizing things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Taking
you have to be
over
really
somebody.
careful.
Yeah, and then him showing him all the magic of the island and then turning around and being made a slave.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be a little mad too.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions, favorite Frankenstein things? No? Okay. Well, thank you for letting me come and talk. I appreciate it.